Hello and welcome to another episode of Radio War Nerd. The date today is September 23rd, 2021, and this is episode 297. I'm the host, Mark Ames. I'm back in Rochester, New York. Was gone between shows. Anyway, thanks again for people asking about my mother. She's back home now and actually recovering pretty remarkably well considering her age and the severity of her injury, but she's doing well. So I just went back there and helped her get set up at home. Now I'm back in Rochester.
That's good news anyway.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. Anyway, I'm on the line with the feller you just heard, the War Nerd, aka Gary Brecher, aka John Dolan. Somebody suggested that it should be done the other way around, and I totally agree with that. I agree with any mixing it up there. But anyways, welcome back.
Well, thanks. I mean, I've always stated my preference for Brecher. It's just that I don't feel that I really live up to Brecher, so I have to go with the real name.
So where are you now? You guys keep working your way down the peninsula. Most armies work their way up that peninsula. You guys are working your way down it.
Yeah. Well, we're in a place that an army worked its way into in a kind of memorable way. That's the thing. We keep hitting different points on the Adriatic eastern, that is, coast of Italy, and you keep running into, that was the town where the Turks landed, and things got a little gory after that. And as I've said before, it gives you a really different impression of European history. The Northern Europeans didn't have to deal with the Ottoman Empire quite the way the southern and southeastern parts did. So this time we came, not for historical reasons, but because it's supposed to be a great place, to a town called Otranto. And it's famous for two things, the Castle of Otranto, the Gothic novel, and in Italian terms, it's famous for what happened in 1480. People don't generally know that the Ottoman Empire was planning to take Italy. That was quite an important goal for the Ottoman Empire, which was pretty much unstoppable in the late 15th century. They'd taken Constantinople in 1453, of course, and the next step was, as Mehmet, the Sultan in 1480 saw it, the next step was to take Rome. And it was a perfectly feasible idea. The first step was going to be landing at Otranto, which was a good port just across from Vlahe, the Albanian town. The Adriatic is pretty narrow, pretty shallow. You can easily cross. So summer 1480, 20,000 Ottoman Turks land. They surround Otranto, finally besiege it, and after 2 weeks of fighting, they take it. It was unusually bloody. First, the whole town was sacked. 12,000 people were killed, 5,000 more enslaved. But the most dramatic moment in the Italian memory was when 800 men who'd been left alive were told, if you convert, you'll be saved, and we'll throw in a bonus for you. We will unenslave your wives and children. Now, how about, you cannot beat that, guys. Come on. But they refused, and they were beheaded one by one, all 800 of them. And this was such a stunning event that it actually created something like European unity for a moment, a thing unheard of. And French, Genoese, other ships and contingents arrived, and basically out of 20,000 Turkish soldiers, a few hundred survived, and the project was pretty much abandoned. I mean, Mehmet had planned to try again, but he died of disease in Constantinople, or poison, nobody's sure. and the project was abandoned. But the best part of that European unity story is European unity, except for the Venetians, who said, "What are you talking about? We just made a deal with the Ottomans in 1470, and it cost us a lot of money, okay? Good money. You think we are going to throw that away and run into trouble with them again just because you're about to be invaded? You're crazy. It would take them a long time to get up to Venice." So the Venetians wanted no part of it, but a lot of others did for once, and they were successful. At some pretty terrible costs. A lot of people on this coast got taken into slavery. A lot of people got killed. It really strikes you again and again as you move down the coast.
Yeah, you've talked about that in the past. Basically in the southern, especially this what would be the eastern and the southeastern coast of Italy, and the southern coast, and like probably Sicily as well. They have a much different memory. I think there was a brief, one of the many Twitter, sort of scandals recently when somebody, it's basically academic or kind of undergrad or grad school academic fights, but somebody came out hailing the Ottoman Empire's multiculturalism, and it's like, where do you start there? There you could say that there were periods compared to some other countries, I guess you'd say, or kingdoms, when it might have been less horrifically intolerant than a lot of what was going on. But I'm not sure you'd call it multiculturalism,
No, I think that's generally a performative thing by Western academics. Like, I'm more in favor of the Ottoman Empire than of the others, Western Empire. Yeah, come on. It's like an empire is an empire. Don't sentimentalize.
And they were snobs anyway to a lot of their subjects. I mean, we kept coming across this in their North African, holdings as well, basically to the Arabs.
Yes. Turks and Arabs. I mean, that alleged friendship is very recent, if it's real at all.
Right. So you guys, I just looked it up. I mean, you're right practically at the point of the heel, in the Italian boot there. I mean, you're just like 5 miles from the tip of the point. It seems like
we're the corn on the Italian heel.
Yeah.
What's it's it like a beautiful place. Oh, it's fantastic. I have
some photos
say,
look nice. Yeah.
Yeah, Toronto is one of the most beautiful places I've ever seen. It's extraordinary. It feels like Malibu, only it's not as expensive as Malibu. And the sea is a lot better. I don't know why Italy has this rep as being expensive. It's really not. And when you can look out on clear blue water and not pay a lot of money, why the hell not?
Yeah.
The one thing I will say, though, is we rented a car, and I haven't driven a car except for 1 week car rental in Saudi Arabia, which is another story. I haven't driven a car for at least 6 years, maybe more. And I got my license in New York, boasted about that on the show during the summer.
I'm guessing Italy's not where you want to pick up driving again after a long break.
No. There was this terrible moment. I mean, I've only driven really old cars, and I don't know how to start the new cars.
I know.
I couldn't start this in the parking lot, and I was whining and shrieking, and finally this guy came over and showed me how to start it, and then I had to figure out that although it starts in a new way, it's also a stick shift, and I haven't driven a stick shift in a really long time, not since New Zealand. So we get out on the road, and then you find then you encounter rural southern Italian driving, and it's no joke. It's very individualistic. A lot of different styles, from merging by zooming on to the highway at 130K to merging by coming onto the highway and then stopping dead. I mean, everything from Ferraris to weird little cars that seem to come out of a Peter Sellers comedy from like 1963, driven by people who seem to be at least 100 years old. Quite a range. And
you wonder how they live that long drive. I mean, I don't know if it's like what I remember from Albania once years ago, driving from Albania with a friend of mine, with Bill, Bill Gould, and we drove from Albania into Kosovo, and all I remember was increasing frequency of little memorials on the side of the road with a face and flowers, and they kept getting and the driver would only go faster, and we'd be like swerving on two wheels around corners that had no guardrails, and there'd be like six memorials right there, and it was like, holy shit, time to get knowing Yahweh again fast. I mean,
well, I suppose there's a logic to it. Oh, a dangerous place, let's get away from it really fast.
Yeah, I don't think he was thinking that. It was more like, fate, whatever fate has in store for me. It's not fate, it's your foot on the fucking gas pedal. But, it was not
I felt that way. I felt that way in, taxis in the Middle East, or even in Moscow in some taxis. It's like, but, at least if we die, it won't be my fault. But this was me driving, and it would have been my fault. And that really weighed on
different. Me. Yeah. On your memorial there, it would say it was his fault. So
it was totally his fault.
Of that.
Couldn't drive to save his life. Stupid foreigner. Yeah.
So all right, so let's get back now to part two. As I thought, folks is very excited to get the Radio War Nerd Civil War series started, and last episode, you introduced the character of Adam Gorowski, the Polish count, and patron saint of war nerds. He got it right, a lot right, and it was a good sort of person. I think we'll be coming back to what he's been saying throughout the series, right? I mean, we'll be.
Gorowski's perspective. Yeah, it's really important. I introduced a couple of perspectives I'm going to come back to. One was Gorowski. The other is John Beatty, who wrote a war diary called The Citizen Soldier. And I'll be coming back to that too. And to other war diaries. The war diaries are really important. We should even get to Mary Boykin Chestnut, this very strange, very intelligent, completely crazy South Carolina Confederate woman. Her diary is extraordinary. But yeah, there are a lot of things we need to introduce. Some people are saying that we could do 20 episodes on this, but we won't. And they said, why not? And I guess we need to see how people react. If people really want 20 episodes, it wouldn't be hard. There's so many things to do. When I was preparing this one, I was thinking, you really got to do something on American religion, because this is another thing people don't understand. The Christianity of the North, particularly of New England, was a very different religion from the Christianity of the South. And in some ways, this had aspects of a sectarian war that just don't get covered. So maybe we should spend some time on that too. And there's so many other things. But tentatively, I thought maybe the episode after this, we better get to the war. So I'll try to talk about what happened at Bull Run, the first major battle, and how the armies were organized at that point.
Oh, yeah. Good.
But today, I think we should talk about a part of the war that is covered a little, but in a really bad way. That's the whole Bleeding Kansas question, the Civil War before the Civil War that happened in Kansas and Missouri. And the point of this is going to be to talk a little bit about how badly this is covered, and to use it as a corrective example of American unexceptionalism. That is, there are aspects of the Civil War that were really impressive. I've said a lot of times in Gettysburg there were like 54,000 casualties, and one of them was a civilian, and that's really, really unusual in the history of war, and very impressive. But there were other parts of the war that were not like that at all. Kansas, Missouri was a very, very dirty war in a way that's very typical of this planet when dirty wars break out. And I want to break away from the both sidesism to point out that the dirtiest part of it was mostly Confederate. I'm sorry, but that's the way it is. And nobody seems willing to say that, because there's been this spell of reconciliation cast, at least among white Americans, about the Civil War. And we've talked briefly about this in the first episode, in which it was all either a tragedy or a mistake or an inevitable geological process or something, when really it was a mass insanity by a part of the American oligarchy, specifically the slave-owning part of the oligarchy, which had run the country, terrorized the rest of the oligarchy, and ignored the rest of the population for a long time, and suddenly had to deal with opposition and went completely insane.
I think to that point, I mean, this, because you wonder, why isn't there more on what went on in what would be called the West and in Missouri and Kansas? Because when you see what goes on in Kansas, you really understand the Civil War a lot better. It becomes a lot more visceral and also kind of weirdly familiar in some ways. I mean, we're not there yet, but you can kind of see now like where that road comes to. But that completely goes against the narrative of, if you stick to the large set battle pieces that went on in the East, then you can kind of frame it as a tragedy, letter writers, guys in white gloves versus other guys in white gloves surveying the large battlefields with dead bodies. Like, what goes on in the West is more normal, real, visceral warfare. And it's an ugly story. And you can't, when you get to that visceral level, it's pretty damn clear who the good guys and the bad guys are. That doesn't always happen in wars, but it happened definitely here.
Yeah. If you go by nothing else, the preponderance of the violence and the question of who starts the violence, it's just really easy to see that the quickest resort to violence and the quickest to threaten violence and the ones to propose truly monstrous violence are always those from the slave-owning elite. And just to give a really dramatic example of that, that's not from Kansas or Missouri specifically, but is in a way from Kentucky, another border state where things got very dirty. But mainly just because nobody knows this, and it's an incredible story, I want to talk about the Confederate yellow fever plot. Now, few people even know the name Luke P. Blackburn, and fewer than that know what he did, which was pretty astonishing. Luke Blackburn was a doctor and politician from Kentucky. That was a common combination. He went to Transylvania University in Kentucky, in fact, which is oddly filled with important Civil War figures, most of them on the Confederate side. He's mainly known because he was the 28th governor of Kentucky. He was elected in 1879. He's somewhat less known for the fact that he attempted to introduce yellow fever, the disease that terrified Victorian Americans more than any other, to New York City. I've only found a few books that even mention this, so I'll list them here in case anybody wants to read them. He's mentioned for less than a page in a book on yellow fever called The American Plague. The American Plague, Molly Caldwell Crosby. That's her book, The American Plague. The other one, which tries to cover Luke Blackburn's atrocity, is called The Confederate Yellow Fever Conspiracy, The Warfare Plot of Luke Pryor Blackburn. We'll stick with The Confederate Yellow Fever Conspiracy by H. Leon Green. I have to warn people, this one deals with the plot in detail. it's not very well written. So you really have to work hard to figure out who did what and to whom. Yellow fever, first of all, is one of those diseases that was finally destroyed. But
was that through vaccinations, or how was it?
Yeah. And when they figured out that it was mosquito borne, they were able to
right.
prescribe some preventative measures. But at this point, it was so terrifying that it changed settlement patterns. It tended to break out on river towns, which had originally been, like Memphis, had originally been full of immigrants from various groups. And most of those immigrants, after a big wave of yellow fever, just fled. And Memphis was sort of repopulated by rural peasants of standard Scots-Irish, as they're called, stock. So it had a huge impact. It drove people to their deaths in a couple of days. They spewed black vomit. They went crazy. They died. And it came out in various ways in the early parts of the Civil War. Before we get to Luke Blackburn's plot, another way yellow fever came into play was when Benjamin Butler, a really underrated Union general, occupied New Orleans. And to show you the indulgence with which the Union troops regarded white Southerners, there were Southern sympathizers or Confederate civilians walking the streets. They had notepads and tape measures, and they were taking the height and width measurements in this Benny Hill way of every Union soldier they ran into, explaining that they'd been hired to make coffins for all the Union soldiers who were going to die of yellow fever. And nobody stopped them. I guess the only thing soldiers were allowed to do is like, well, that's just your opinion, man. But it was actually Butler's hated to this day by Confederate sympathizers. To this day, there was a death warrant out on him. But his quarantine rules for New Orleans actually stopped yellow fever, and it came back in 1866, right after the war ended. But anyway, Luke Blackburn was
again. I'm sorry today. Yeah, it's like vaccine measures. Measures to protect us from a virus, our liberties. Yeah. Anyway.
Yep. Yeah. Well, I know this is going to be a cliche of the series, but there are a lot of echoes here of the contemporary American political scene. I mean, Missouri, Kansas. Yeah. Well, okay. I almost feel like a Norm Macdonald. Missouri, Kansas. Well, yeah. Missouri. Yeah. Oh boy. Luke Blackburn was too old to fight for the Confederacy, but he was a rich, educated white Southerner, which meant he was naturally extreme pro-Confederate. There were a few exceptions, not many. So he had some experience treating yellow fever, not with much success, but then neither did anybody else. He thought he knew what he was doing. He didn't. He didn't know, for example, that it was transmitted by mosquitoes, but he thought it could be transmitted by infected clothing, the way smallpox was. Smallpox had been used by General Lord Jeffrey Amherst in 1763 to infect Indians who were not on the British side, and it was used very successfully. So there was a history of this in a horrible way, and Blackburn thought it could be used again. And so he first went to Canada, and this is another interesting sidelight. Canada was Anglo-Canada anyway, was very, very pro-Confederate. The surveys of the time showed it was about 5-1 pro-Confederate versus pro-Union. 3/4 of the Canadian newspapers were pro-Confederate. Toronto, in particular, was a very, very big center of Confederate espionage. Toronto at the time had a reputation as the most orange city outside Belfast and Glasgow. and that demographic was generally very pro-Southern. For example, John Wilkes Booth met his fellow conspirators in Toronto in 1864. And that was 1863, 1864. That was when this respectable Dr. Luke Blackburn went up to Canada and started thinking about how he could infect hundreds of thousands of New York civilians with yellow fever. The South is losing, and when a threatened fascist state is starting to lose, they really start thinking hard about genocide. And
the Nazis after Stalin.
Yeah, it does. Yeah, there are a lot of bad Nazi analogies, but that's one that's pretty good. Defeat generally leads to kill all the prisoners, and hated ethnic groups are basically prisoners of states like that. So Toronto was also, the home of the so-called Tories, the Americans who'd sided against the American Revolution, and they were very influential. So it was very easy for Confederates to hang around there. There's a diary entry from a Union guy in Montreal, which was also a big pro-Confederate stronghold. I don't think among the French, as far as I know, but the French didn't matter very much in 1863. The Anglos ruled in Montreal. So he says, quote, "I found but one hotel in Montreal where a Union man could stop and sojourn without being insulted daily and hourly at the table and in the parlors. The other hotels are as full of secessionists, as an egg is full of meat." And he added, "The war interrupts their trade." So like we found out about Afghanistan, a lot of this comes down to money. So Blackburn's first plan was to poison the reservoir that contained New York City's water supply. He calculated how much poison he would need: strychnine, arsenic, prussic acid, cyanide. But they decided the poison to kill everybody in New York City would be too expensive. And another Confederate doctor who was involved in the plan said, "Well, let's buy some poison in Europe. It's cheaper there." But then they came up with a much cheaper method of dealing with New York. They were going to burn it. And this one was actually carried out. November 7th, 1864 was the election day. Lincoln was reelected. They didn't like that. They didn't like it when he was elected the first time, and they didn't like his reelection either. So November 25th, 1864, arsonists working for the Confederacy were going to start 32 fires in New York, including 19 hotels, a theater, a museum. And they did it. 15 hotels had fires, but it didn't burn. And so basically, they were poor Blackburn, nothing seems to work. It's like, how can you kill New York? So this is where he turns to his medical training. And he says to himself, there's yellow fever kills a lot of people. I know yellow fever, he thought he did, and he thought it was from clothes. Where is there a yellow fever epidemic? Bermuda. So he sails to Bermuda on a blockade runner. So much for the Anaconda plan. Anyway, he got to Bermuda easily. And he treated people with yellow fever supposedly for charity. See, never trust an NGO. But the real point was to keep their infected clothing. He wanted to do smallpox too. And the scary thing about that is it would have worked. But there wasn't much smallpox in Bermuda at the time. Bermuda was not a big resort at the time. It was kind of a wretched place.
They didn't have golf there yet.
No golf, no nothing.
No casinos.
Yeah, I mean, they'd had a real yellow fever epidemic. 3.5% of the population was killed in the 1860s. But Blackburn bought a ton of clothes. Collected a ton of clothes from yellow fever patients. Sailing from Nova Scotia, another Canadian connection, and he sent it back to his agent, who Okay, this guy is a pro-Confederate Jew named Hyams. We're in Mel Brooks territory, who named his son. He had two sons. He named one Stonewall Jackson Hyams and the other Jefferson Davis Hyams.
Oh, my God. Yes.
Yeah. I don't know if they changed
the tribe has a lot of variety to it,
Yeah. Wow. And the plan was to send 10 trunks of infected clothing to New York City. It's not known whether this was actually carried out. What did happen is he started getting blackmailed by his co-conspirators. The Confederates said when this plot was exposed, because his co-conspirators in 1864 started selling their stories to Northern newspaper, the Confederates said in another very familiar way, "You did worse stuff. We just don't know about it because you're censoring the news."
Right.
There's even some evidence that Jefferson Davis himself approved of the plan. But all this is, these things happen in wars. Wars are dirty businesses. That's a little dirtier than usual, and it's certainly nothing like Gettysburg. But the really amazing thing about this is Blackburn didn't spend one day in prison. He became a Kentucky, and everybody knew about this. Everybody knew this plot. He didn't spend one day in prison. He went back into politics, ran for governor in 1879. The opposition brought up the yellow fever plot. He didn't deny it. He basically said the American people don't want to hear about that. The Kentucky people.
We've moved on already. People want to move on.
We've moved on. Yeah. And one Kentucky editor said Kentucky people didn't know about it, and if they did, it was to his credit. And this is something that really doesn't get covered. So what I'm talking about today, what I hope will unite everything we talk about today, is going to underline some points we've made several times on Radio War Nerd. That first of all, both sidesism is hardly ever true. Usually there's somebody doing the aggression and somebody taking it. Atrocities are rarely 50-50 either. And in talking about Kansas and Missouri, the thing that gets obscured is, first of all, that Kansas violence was overwhelmingly by pro-slavery settlers against anti-slavery settlers. And the government, from federal to state to local, was invariably on the side of the pro-slavery faction. That's
right.
Why they were able to reach a stalemate for a long time, even though they were outnumbered. And in that way, it's kind of a microcosm of the Civil War as a whole. And every time the plan for the pro-slavery faction was to kill civilians and to kill enough of them to scare the rest of them out.
Terror. I mean, it was literally pure terror.
Yeah, pure terror. I want to mention, too, that I read 2 recent books about this to see if the both sidesism has changed. And it hasn't. The 2 that I read, in case anybody wants to try, are Bleeding Kansas, Bleeding Missouri, a book of academic essays from 2012. And to show the level of provincialism in this part of history, it's like scholars of the Civil War from Kansas and Missouri never get together with each other. It's like, come on, you're 2 states, you're right next door to each other, and you're the dueling factions, but that's how they see it.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. We kind of left one little thing hanging. What happened to my man Hyams? Did Stonewall Jackson and Jefferson Davis revert to their Hebrew names? Stonewall is Shlomo and Jefferson is Gilly or something like that.
We
don't talk about my original name anymore around here. Dad was an idiot.
Oh yeah, it's like that young Frankenstein thing. It's Steinwall, actually. It's like Jackson.
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't know. Hyams was pretty obscure. And he lived in poverty. He just sort of drifted into the underworld after the war ended. But he also wasn't prosecuted in any way. Nobody was. Anyway, the other book.
Sorry about that.
No, that's all right. It's what I would love to know. I'll check it out. The other book I've checked out recently is called "War to the Knife," about the Kansas-Missouri Wars by somebody named Thomas Goodrich, and that veers from both sidesism to pro-Confederate irregular-ism, if that's an ism, and that's surprisingly common. I'll get into some examples of that as we go along. As you said last week, not all our listeners are steeped in the American Civil War. Not all our listeners are Americans. So, quick timeline. We'll start with 1854. You can start, as Warner always says, you can start anywhere, but that's a reasonable place to start. 1854, the Senate, which is really the choke point of power in the United States oligarchy, decides that the Missouri Compromise is supposed to limit or delimit the spread of slavery by admitting Missouri as a slave state and Maine as a free state is not good enough anymore. So they passed the Kansas-Nebraska Act, repealing the Missouri Compromise, creating two new territories, Kansas, which is roughly what Kansas is now, and Nebraska, which at that time stretches all the way up to the Canadian border. They accepted that Nebraska was going to be a free state, but the question became, what about Kansas? There couldn't be two new states that were both anti-slavery because the proto-Confederates, if you want to call them that, people like Jeff Davis, who were at the very center of American power but had no loyalty to the American state, could not lose their stranglehold on the Senate. They weren't even trying to keep a stranglehold on the House of Representatives because that was based on population, and the North's population was zooming. The South's population was not only much smaller, but a big part of it was made up of enslaved people who obviously didn't get to vote or have any other political rights. And by the way, Mark, you found a graph, right? You found a graph explaining why that form of, quote, property was so important.
Yeah, it's pretty. I can't remember where I came across it, but I was researching something some years ago, looking again at inequality and states' rights and stuff, and trying to find the value of slaves because and also this was when. I mean, I really feel like it's only been in sort of the last 4 or 5 years that this idea that the war wasn't really about slavery but was about states' rights. That idea is no longer so popular, so sort of common or popular in polite circles. But even just up until 5+ years ago, it was still pretty common to say it wasn't really about slavery. So you can see from this graph, and I'll post it in this episode as well. But it sort of goes up and down between like 1800 and 1835, and then it kind of has a little peak, and then there's the 1837 crash, and it goes back down again, hovers, and really around 1850, between 1850 and the start of the war. In 1860, it's just a straight up vertical, the value of the slaves there. That's where all the wealth was in those assets. I mean, that's what they were. They were assets. They were assets that were financialized even by banks. I mean, it's just gruesome stuff, and it's like capitalism at its rawest.
And it partly explains the incredible ferocity of Confederate attitudes. Not entirely, because There were a lot of dupes who didn't have any real stake. But, well, as many historians have said, they had a stake in a way that we don't have time to get into in this episode. We'll get into it when we talk about race in the Civil War. Because white was a caste as well as a class, there was, so as a white, you were convinced that you had a stake in this, even if you were living in a shack, and a lot of them were. So, but the wealth was in the slaves. And that is reflected in the fact that all the officials who had any role in the Kansas-Missouri War until very late in the game were not just pro-slavery, but violently, fanatically pro-slavery. Starting with basically the de facto ruler of Missouri, David Rice Atchison, owned many slaves, had a plantation, pro-slavery activist, ran the border ruffians who regularly invaded Kansas to terrorize free soil people. There was not a lot of Kansas raiding into Missouri. It was very much a one-sided thing, Missourians raiding Kansas. And there's a history for this. In 1838, some American history people may remember, and I know you'll remember, Mark, because fellow Mormon fan. In 1838, Missourians terrorized the Mormons out of the state. That's how the Mormons ended up in Utah. They just decided we need to get away from these people, as far away as possible. And Atchison had a role in that. And so when he started talking to Jefferson Davis about what he was going to do to the anti-slavery settlers in Kansas, he said, "We are organizing. We will be compelled to shoot, burn, and hang, but the thing will soon be over. We intend to Mormonize the abolitionists," because it had worked against the Mormons. They were an unpopular religious sect, and they had been driven out. They had been driven like 1,500 miles across the country, and a lot of them killed as well. So there was a precedent for this. It, reminds me of that oft-quoted bit, who worries about the Armenians. They had carried out, if not a genocide, a gigantic pogrom against the Mormons.
Definitely, yeah.
Yeah.
Joseph Smith came away from that. He came away from that for abolition of jails, of imprisonment. And that became sort of at least a lifelong, however little his life continued after that. Plank of his actually ran for president, and that was one of his main planks. And he was anti-slavery as well, but he was anti-prison because the pogromists also locked him up in prison and tortured him and stuff. So yeah.
And they killed him in a jail, actually.
That was in Illinois.
Right, but that's right. But but he was then he was kind of he was prescient, as they say.
Yes. Yeah,
jails are bad luck for me.
The magic rocks kind of told him.
Stay away from jails. Every time, and keep in mind, Atchison is the ruler. He's an esteemed statesman. He's the ruler of the state. He runs the place, but he not only runs the border ruffians, he does it not under the table at all. He shrieks about it. He leads these people into Kansas before a vote on a referendum about whether Kansas will be pro or anti-slavery with this quote: "Mark every scoundrel among you that is the least tainted with free soilism or abolitionism and exterminate him. We can send 5,000, enough to kill every goddamned abolitionist in the territory." That's the Kansas territory. And he meant it. That was what they did. I wrote a Tigray newsletter, and as I said in that, the point of massacres isn't usually to kill every member of the population. It's to kill a lot of them in such a scary way that the rest of them flee. That's what they did to the Mormons, and that was probably the plan here. Mm-hmm. There was an organized effort to settle New Englanders in Kansas once the Kansas-Nebraska Act was passed, because they knew this was important. And again, reading about this was a sad reminder that America has lost a lot of its energy. In our lifetime, we've heard people say, if we could get 20,000 people together, we could dominate Idaho or something like that, whether it's libertarians or liberals or something like that. Nothing ever comes of it, really, except for a few half-assed libertarian projects that descended.
The Free State of Keene in New Hampshire.
Right. Is that the one where they had the bear problem?
Is it? I'm not sure. I know that they had a libertarian problem. I don't know. The usual kind of goofy libertarian problems. It turns out we need some government to fill in your government service there. Of course, the locals.
God, being a local official in a libertarian city would be like hell. I mean, that's the kind of people who live for city council meetings.
City council meetings and violating petty laws and screaming about tyranny. Like, women should be able to go bare-chested too, and so they're doing that and then protesting the tyranny against them, and a lot of pot tyranny, although I think New Hampshire's pretty lax about pot, I think. But there's a lot of like sort of very petty issues, sovereign citizen stuff. Like, I don't need to drive around with a license. I'm a sovereign citizen. Okay, here we go again. Yeah.
But in 1854, it was dead serious. And there were formed, first of all, the Massachusetts Emigrant Aid Society, then the New England Emigrant Aid Company as a more regional enterprise. And a few wealthy New England anti-slavery activists funded most of this. And they paid the fares for New England settlers to come out to Kansas, basically to become anti-slavery settlers and voters. And it worked. Throughout the 1850s, the proportion of New England people who came by rail as far as they could and then by wagon to Kansas exceeded the number of people who came from right next door in Missouri. And basically the war was ended, little spoiler, by 1860, because there were just so many more free soilers. Even if they weren't as violent, there were just too many of them. But so that worked. That attempt to do an ideologically grounded resettlement pattern really worked. And that's that's part of the reason that people like Atchison had to resort to terror, because they were losing the numbers game. So the other thing they resorted to was voter fraud. Basically voter fraud at the point of a gun. Yeah. And every time there was an election, and there were several in Kansas in the 1850s, every time there was an election to decide the question of pro or anti-slavery, people would surge across the border from Missouri, heavily armed, 24/7 drunk, by all accounts, and eager to find somebody to kill. And they would basically ask you who you were going to vote for, and if it was wrong, you were taking your life in your hands. So in most of those elections, the anti-slavery voters tend to stay home. You might ask, where was the federal government? Well, once again, the federal government and the state government, every government was totally on the side of the pro-slavery people. So this is an example of the kind of fraud that was possible under those conditions. Quote, pro-slavery supporters stuffed so many ballots that the number of votes cast in Leavenworth, Kansas, was 5 times the size of the town's population. And throughout Kansas, twice as many ballots were cast as there were registered voters. 90% of the vote went to pro-slavery candidates, many residing in Missouri. Free Soil Kansas began referring to the incoming governing body as the bogus legislature before officials even finished tallying the votes. So this bogus legislature picked a bogus capital, Lecompton, the so-called capital of Kansas, and Lecompton became a metonymy for pro-slavery fraudulent voter terrorists. This did not bother the people appointed to govern Kansas by the federal government. Kansas was a territory. It wasn't a state yet. That meant the president appointed the governor. Both presidents in this era, Franklin Pierce and then Buchanan, were very much pro-slavery, terrified of Southern power or just in favor of it.
And one thing, I know you're going to get into this, but they, every time both of them send in a governor to replace the previous governor, who every time they're very sympathetic to the South, to slavery, these new governors, and they're there to basically kick some Northern abolitionists. But remember, abolitionists, at this point, I guess, outside of the Northeast and sort of the North, they were still considered pretty radical. And they would eventually be forced out. They come there feeling that way, and then they would see actually Atchinson's, gangsters and the pro-slavery crowd, what they would do, and they would turn quickly, and then they'd get thrown out and replaced by a new pro-slavery governor. It's like, okay, this should be easy. Show me the Northerners here. And within 6 months, that guy would be thrown out for just realizing, my God, the other side are psychos. I was wrong. Over and over and over. Yeah. It's an incredible story.
Yeah, it's a remarkable pattern. I mean, I've seen something similar with hardcore Ulster Protestant. Like, why don't we have any friends? Why is everyone against us? Yeah. It's like, well, you're crazy. So, after the Kansas-Nebraska Act is passed, President Franklin Pierce appoints a guy named Wilson Shannon as Kansas governor, and he was known as, quote, an extreme Southern man in politics of the border ruffian type. And he has his chance to show the rule of law, because a free soil settler is murdered, as so often was the case, by a pro-slavery neighbor. And as if that made them even angrier, 1,500 pro-slavery Missourians cross over to Lawrence, Kansas. But Lawrence, Kansas is ready. They've also been sending rifles from New England. And by the way, I've never been fond of Thoreau and Emerson and those people, but goddamn, New England culture circa 1860 is pretty impressive. I mean, most of the patents in the U.S., 93% came out of New England in this era. They were an extraordinary people, and there ain't no getting around it, even if their literature is not quite to my taste.
I was going to say, that was one of their big crimes for me. It's like, well, if you can't write good literature, then, but yeah,
they were an impressive people, and they fought like hell when it was time for them to fight, and they didn't woof. It was impressive. But anyway, so they sent rifles. There are 1,000 anti-slavery settlers in Lawrence, Kansas, near the Missouri border, waiting for these 1,500 Missouri bushwhackers or border ruffians, whatever you want to call them. They're waiting for federal troops to do something. The federal troops do nothing. Pierce administration refuses to act. Governor Shannon does a classic both sidesism. He says, disband, disband, disband. And then a little bit later, the Missourians come back. 800 Missourians with 5 cannon. The anti-slavery settlers are still trying to obey the truce imposed by the governor and the president. They stand down. The Missourians destroy newspaper offices, confiscate all their rifles, leaving them defenseless. And basically, the government makes a point of doing nothing in their defense. It's also interesting that they sacked both newspapers. There's example after example of pro-slavery mobs destroying newspaper offices. You see this in a lot of fascist discourse, but here especially, it's like, we're not going to try to win the argument. Never mind your argument. If you say anything anti-slavery, we'll kill you. That's the argument.
That fraudulently elected pro-slavery Kansas legislature, they passed a slave code, some code or laws, imposing a fine and imprisonment for expressing opinions against slavery, and the death penalty for encouraging slave revolts or helping slaves to escape. And all voters would have to take an oath to uphold those laws. I mean, it was a crazy code that was one of like a series of things that started driving the North increasingly crazier, like because the South just went so far. But yeah.
No, it was impossible to appease the South. And that is scientifically demonstrated, because it's hard to think of an historical example of more protracted and intense attempts to appease them. You just couldn't. They were crazy. And I think a lot of it has to do with that slave value thing you found. But it's also, I think, a difference between the cultures. We will have to talk about religion and society in these two regions. I mean, there's more than two regions, but basically in some ways it comes to Deep South versus New England. There's a lot of other regions involved, but those are very different cultures. But anyway, this right on top of this came an event that I think a lot of American kids even vaguely remember: the beating of Charles Sumner. And Sumner was a really impressive guy, one of those New Englanders. Wouldn't have liked me or my kind very much, but he was a great guy. And he gave a 2-day speech against slavery and against Senator Butler of South Carolina, who had made some idiotic pronouncement in favor of slavery. And he said Butler had chosen a mistress who, though polluted in the sight of the world, is chaste in his sight. I mean the harlot, slavery. And there was something about sexualizing the attack on slavery that drove the South crazier than ever, which one would not have thought possible. So Preston Brooks, a South Carolina congressman who was related to Senator Butler because the Southern elite was tiny and incestuous. How they got that way so fast, they outdid anything in Europe, as Gorowski said, and they'd done it in a few generations. But anyway, Brooks came up to him, and with a crony holding a pistol on the rest of the senators, and with Sumner pinned to this bolted down desk, he beat him over the head with a cane until the cane broke, and Sumner was left with permanent brain damage. He was never the same. Preston Brooks later dodged the opportunity to duel another anti-slavery congressman who was known as a marksman and died ignominiously of illness afterwards. It's just a loathsome story. And it finally broke through the crust of decades of don't make the South mad, don't make the South mad. It was like, okay, there's no dealing with you people.
Well, and it wasn't even just that, it was the reaction from the rest of the South, which was, yes, great, this is awesome, you did so well. And all the newspapers were cheering it on. People sent canes to Brooks, with mottos, hit him again, and use knockdown arguments. And they cheered it. They loved it. And at that point, the North is like, we are dealing with, Chuck Manson here. Like, we're not going to be talking to these people anymore. Like, we got to do something. The Richmond Enquirer, the vulgar, there was a lot of talk in the North, like, do they think we're their slaves just because we've been acting like it for a long time? Do they chastise us the same way? I mean, the Richmond Enquirer said so. It said, a very pro-slavery paper, the vulgar abolitionists in the Senate are getting above themselves. They have grown saucy and dare to be impudent to gentlemen. The truth is they have been suffered to run too long without collars. They must be lashed into submission. This whole gentleman thing is there's your
quite
Southern gentleman, business. I know.
Where they got that, I don't know. But anyway, Gorowski is good on that too. Why are they gentlemen? But so John Brown was in Kansas. He's lived through these two horrific events. Lawrence, Kansas being sacked with zero help from the federal government or the U.S. Army after it had stood down peaceably. And then the loudest and clearest abolitionist voice in the Senate beaten half to death on the Senate floor. And Brown, according to these both sides accounts, went crazy. I mean, it doesn't seem crazy to me, but he said, something must be done to show these barbarians that we too have rights. So in May 1856, he takes a group of followers along Pottawatomie Creek, 40 miles south of Lawrence, and kills 5 pro-slavery activists. This is known as the Pottawatomie Massacre, and you will find a million references to it everywhere. You will never see anything about the dozens of much bigger, more atrocious massacres carried out by the pro-slavery side. There's something about it that just fascinates people. I mean, murders are like that. Some murders really grab the public attention, and it's almost like Irish literature where there's like 50 different plays and stories about the killing of a British soldier, when if you look cold-bloodedly at the casualty rate on the two sides, it would be like 100,000 Irish killed for every British soldier killed. But they're not interested in those. They're interested in the killing of the one British soldier. And here, the U.S., just do a search, massacre Kansas, Missouri, and you will find Pottawatomie, the killing of 5 pro-slavery settlers. In my experience, the first 10 mentions, that's what you get on Google. So Kansas is now running the whole country in a way. Kansas is the center of American attention, even though nobody's really been there. And it even does something rather odd. It eclipses sectarianism in American politics. This isn't something, we'll get to this. I think we need to talk about religion in the Civil War, and hating Catholics was a big deal for a lot of reasons. The Irish were the terrified immigrants willing to work for pennies, and it was having a real effect on jobs. They were papists also, and anti-Catholicism was much more intense than people realize now. But it was starting to become clear, like, well, we got bigger problems here. It's all going to come down to north-south here. And know-nothingism, which had been a big part of the Republican Party and of the whole virtuous New England reform movement, which in many ways was admirable. It was part of the formation of the Republican Party, in fact, but it just didn't seem as big now.
It sort of peaked and ebbed pretty quickly because of what was going on in the 1850s. Other priorities. The South in the 1856 presidential election is already threatening to secede if Fremont, who was the first Republican candidate, wins the election. I mean, this idea that, it was all Lincoln, or it was Lincoln trying to reinforce Fort Sumter, it's just utter nonsense. We talked in the first show about how they'd been threatening to secede for decades. It's their standard thing. And it's either we'll secede or we'll kill you. Those are the two moves. So the governor of Virginia says, if Fremont is elected, there will be a revolution. A lot of Southern governors say this kind of thing. And now Buchanan appoints yet another one of those governors you mentioned, who come in all pro-Southern and leave fanatical Union guys. This was a 6'5", 35-year-old, very tough dude named John Geary. He was appointed as a pro-Southern guy, but here I'm quoting James McPherson, whose chapter on Kansas is really good. It's great.
As we discussed, Mark. Geary was appalled. He had come to Kansas as a Democrat, that is, roughly pro-Southern, who heartily despised the pernicious doctrines of abolition. but he soon became convinced of, quote, the criminal complicity of public officials in trying to make Kansas a slave state at all hazards. End quote. This started him on the path to free soil and a career as a fighting general in the Civil War and Republican governor of Pennsylvania. After this first sack of Kansas, violence becomes general in Kansas. That is, general enough to be noticed by historians, even though there's quite a lot of pro-slavery violence before that. But what gets the attention is what John Brown and his sons and his followers were doing. And yet, those are always attempts to recover from pro-slavery attacks. The so-called battles of Blackjack and Franklin were John Brown and his people trying to recover weapons stolen from Lawrence, Kansas, when it was sacked by pro-slavery raiders from Missouri. There's a free state legislature, by far the more popular one, in Topeka, but it's dispersed by federal action. The Free Staters are sufficiently scared that they decide we're not going to take any part in this vote at all. So another one is appointed. Geary's no longer reliable. You know, they all go off the reservation, as the old political expression was. Now a new governor, Robert Walker, comes in, appointed by Buchanan. Buchanan, by the way, is just a really horrible person.
Yeah.
Hard to imagine worse.
They get worse and worse. It's kind of interesting, isn't it? I mean, Fillmore and, it just gets worse and worse. Fillmore and Pierce, and then Buchanan is really bad. Yeah.
Buchanan's last address was blaming the North for provoking the South into seceding. He blamed the whole coming war on the North. It's extraordinary. I mean, and part of that is this is an oligarchy, and the oligarchs don't want to be split up. They want to continue in control. But anyway, as someone said, 7 governors, all sent as messengers to plant slavery on Kansas soil, had been thwarted and failed. And by now, in the late 1850s, those immigration from New England societies, it's beginning to work. Kansas has an anti-slavery majority. That's why Buchanan appoints this Mississippian, Robert Walker, as governor. But Walker supports a referendum. That is the shocking idea of letting Kansas residents vote.
Democracy, imagine that.
Yeah. Some of these people, like Jeff Davis, say outright, we don't want democracy. We hate democracy. Popular sovereignty is a nasty idea. Jefferson Davis calls
protection
this,
of property is above all the most important. And by property, they mean slaves. Yeah.
Yep. This is a quote from one of them. Right of property is before and higher than any constitutional sanction.
Yep.
So Davis calls it treachery. They just can't understand it. Their governors keep turning on them when their whole purpose is to make Kansas a slave state. Buchanan makes excuses for himself, pretty much giving the game away, saying he had no choice because if he didn't let them have Kansas as a slave state, the South, quote, would either secede or take up arms against me. And so he backs the bogus legislature, not the real one. He blames the abolitionists. He calls for what he calls, quote, treasonable tenacity in their revolutionary course. So it's property versus revolution. That's pretty simple that way. All this time, there are other massacres happening, and they're invariably pro-slavery massacres, and you will have a hard time finding anything about them. One of them happens at a place called Marais des Cygnes. I hope I'm pronouncing it right. That is Swan Marsh. Sounds better in French. This is May 19th, 1858. 30 pro-slavery guys led by Charles Hamilton, Georgia guy, cross into Kansas from territory. capture 11 Free Staters. They're led into a canyon and shot. Not even effectively shot. 5 killed, 5 wounded. 1 didn't even get shot. Sloppy firing squad. Then they return to Missouri. None of them are ever prosecuted. So that's 11 men targeted for execution, 10 shot, 5 killed. Nobody prosecuted. I mean, the Civil War hasn't broken out yet. There's supposedly a law in the country, but the administration is so pro-slavery, so pro-Missouri, that only one man was ever prosecuted, and that was during the war, 1863. He was in prison for a couple of months. Hamilton returned to Georgia, where he died in 1880, just like Blackburn. No prosecution, no inconvenience at all. One of those books I mentioned, published in, I think, 2012, refers to Charles Hamilton as a Southern idealist. I'm not going to listen to any talk about PC after this. It's like, there may be a little of that in the lower ranks of academic circles, but there's a lot more of the other kind of PC in the higher ranks.
Yeah. That's sick. So
anyway, you won't find anything about that massacre, ever. I don't know why. Well, I sort of do know why, but anyway, they weren't finished with Lawrence. The hate of Lawrence, Kansas, as sort of like the geographical node of abolitionism, never went away. I mean, people say Americans don't have a sense of history, but parts of Missouri definitely have way too much of it. In the middle of the Civil War, Quantrill's raiders, Quantrill, along with Bloody Bill Anderson, was one of the big irregular, massacre specialists of Midwestern cavalry. But they kill 182 civilians in Lawrence, Kansas in 1863, and they burn the whole town. 182. You would think that would outweigh John Brown killing 5 pro-slavery settlers after massive provocation, but it doesn't. I thought I'd read a bit of the site called Capital H History and how it treats this. In August 1863, the Union commander along the border, General Thomas Ewing, arrested several wives and sisters of members of a notorious band led by William Quantrill. This gang of outlaws had scorched the region, terrorizing and murdering Union sympathizers. On August 14th, the building in Kansas City, Missouri, where the women were being held, collapsed, killing 5. Quantrill assembled 450 men to exact revenge. Well, no. I mean, first of all, this is kind of like reading the accounts of an American ally and its violence against an American designated enemy. Mm-hmm. You find every excuse for the American ally and none for the enemy. First they mention Quantrill's guys had been going around terrorizing and murdering everybody who showed any sympathy for the Union. And then they say they raided Quantrill just to get revenge for their women folk. I don't think so. Why were they killing those guys before? Suspicion that one day they might kill Quantrill women folk? Jeez. That was fairly obviously an excuse. I mean, there had been attempted sacks of Kansas with murder for a decade already. They didn't need their kinfolk getting killed in a fire that was accidental, for that matter, to lead them to do it again. It was what they did. Mm-hmm. So this is how they describe what happened. After kidnapping 10 farmers in order to guide them to Lawrence, the gang murdered each of them. Quantrill's men rode into Lawrence and dragged 182 men from their homes in front of their families and killed them in cold blood. They burned 185 buildings in Lawrence, which is about how many buildings there were in Lawrence, then rode back to Missouri with Union cavalry in hot pursuit. This incident incited the North and led to even more killing by both sides along the Kansas-Missouri border. It's really extraordinary. The way in which this is attributed to revenge for the women folk without any explanation about why it had been going on for years and years before this, and would be going on for years afterwards, to the point that in Centralia, Missouri, Bloody Bill Anderson, who was known as even more extreme than Quantrill, committed an even bigger murder during the war in Centralia, but he had his own reasons for doing it, the way you have reasons for an air raid or something. But I think the best way to sum up, and really the most extraordinary and surprising summary of what happened, comes from Joe Shelby. And if you know the Western War and the Civil War, you know Joe Shelby has, in some ways, an honorable record as a really good Confederate cavalry commander. Unfortunately, he teamed up with Sterling Price, who was probably along with Pillow, maybe the worst Confederate commander in the West. But Shelby was also one of the big Missouri politicians who organized pogroms into Kansas before the official start of the Civil War. For that, he was not prosecuted or inconvenienced in any way. Nobody was. But when he died in 1897, he apologized. He said, quote, to this historian, Kansas historian William E. Connolly, "I went there to kill Free State men. I did kill them. I am now ashamed of myself for having done so. But then times were different from what they are now." And then he went on to applaud John Brown. He said, quote, "John Brown did in his country what I would have done in mine in like circumstances," end quote. That did not earn Shelby any points with his fellow Confederates. No one who took part in this horrendous violence was hanged. None of the people who organized the gigantic continual pogroms into Kansas was hanged. The only person among those who took part who was hanged was a fellow named John Brown. And when you look at the casualties here, there's a naturally endless dispute, as always in irregular war, about you killed, 30 million of my cousins. No, you killed, 70 million of my grandparents, all of that. But it's pretty clear that the disparity in those killed is at least 3-1. At least 3 anti-slavery settlers killed for every pro-slavery settler killed. And yet it's the Potawatomi massacre that gets the publicity. I think partly there's an element of man bites dog about that, but partly and much more deeply, there's this decision that coalesced in the 1880s that, and you see it in movies like Birth of a Nation, that the disagreement between white Northerners and white Southerners has to be erased, no matter how many horrible things were done in favor of slavery.
Yeah, I brought this up briefly, and I actually don't want to talk too much about it now. Ride with the Devil, this Ang Lee film that takes place in Kansas, Missouri, a border region, right around the time of the Civil War. And I kind of went back again and refreshed myself what the plot was about. And it's told from the point of view of some bushwhackers, and it's pretty damn revisionist. It's not a very good movie. It's based on a novel. It was done in the 90s when people were looking for unconventional angles on anything, is sort of my explanation, I guess. It was written, oddly enough, or at least the screenplay was by James Schamus, who you knew. Right?
Yeah. He appointed me to the editorial board of the Berkeley Poetry Review, and I was very honored. And then he became this giant producer.
Yep. Ted Hope produced it, and Ang Lee, who's done some great films, directed it. It's just not a very good movie. But I want to save that discussion for when we get Eileen Jones on the show to talk about Civil War movies and stuff, and we will get her on the show to talk Civil War movies. I'll be curious what she thinks as well, and we'll all watch it for that point. But yeah, one other thing I wanted to kind of point out here as we were talking about property versus, democracy, and property uber democracy overall, is that sort of old tension in liberalism. We got into this in some of our episodes on populism. I think I got more into it in the episode we did on recovered history of neoliberalism and fascism. That was episode 205, where you have in liberalism sort of political liberalism versus, economic liberalism, whatever you call it, which is the heart of liberalism, which is the sanctity of property. And, in the South, it's pretty clear where it comes down, what side everything comes down on. But it's always been a tension. I mean, you still see this tension coming up through today when people start, as if there's too much democracy. That's never really the problem. It just means people with property are usually afraid of what democracy might bring. The one thing about the Southerners, and you see this with Calhoun too. What do they call? I think somebody called them the marks of the Confederate, or the marks of slavery, or something like that, because they're so open about the politics of slavery and the politics of Southern politics, the hierarchical sort of property politics. Anyway, just mention that there.
The U.S. has gotten a little more like that in my lifetime. It's strange. It was in abeyance for a while, but it's very strong now, and probably going to get stronger.
I mean, I would just guess, if you were to pull the camera far back, that inequality does it. I mean, there's the old quote, you can have, you can update it, you can have billionaires or you can have democracy, but you can't have both. And just inequality of the level that we have now, again, creates such pathologies and sort of dysfunctions in everything except what works for the people who are already winning. And then
we see the same ferocious loyalty to those people from people who have suffered at their hands pretty badly. But that, again, you have to remind yourself that's not abnormal. That may seem weird, but historically it's not weird. I just wanted to mention one more thing, like just as a sidelight. It's not been our main focus now. The main focus is American unexceptionalism, and how there's pretty standard stuff, and it doesn't yield a nice Ken Burns violin solo at all. It's ugly stuff. But how did the Union deal with the continuing massacres during the war? Bloody Bill Anderson at Centralia in Missouri in the middle of the war killed 11 unarmed soldiers who were riding a train, and then killed 123 militiamen who tried to capture his force. So that basically in a couple of days, 150 people were killed. So how did they deal with it? September 28th, 1864, Brigadier General Clinton Fisk writes to William Rosecrans, a great Union commander till he cracked. The capture of the railway train, the inhuman slaughter of the defenseless soldiers thereon, the robbery of the passengers, the burning of the train, must be regarded as one of the chief barbarisms of the war. ... Depopulation and devastation are extreme measures, but if this infernal warfare continues, it will be humane and economic of human life to adopt and vigorously enforce such measures whenever the bushwhackers have more friends than the government. So in other words, the we're all friends here approach of the Union armies during 1861 and 1862. I'll talk about that in another episode. Extraordinary. Like that New Orleans story where they let people go around measuring them for coffins. Standard. They treated slaves very badly, but they were very nicey-nicey around white Southerners. It drove middling officers crazy. They didn't see the sense of it because it had no sense, except economically. But eventually that fails. And Union resorts to depopulation. 4 counties in western Missouri on the Kansas border, the rural areas were completely depopulated in something that was almost, Vietnam-like.
Move them into hamlets, strategic hamlets.
Yeah. Move them away from the border so that they can't threaten the local citizenship. And I'm just going to read one more excerpt from the citizen soldier, John Beatty, this diary that I keep recommending. Beatty is not serving in Missouri, Kansas, but he is in what was considered the West. He's in Tennessee. And this is a really important incident, I think, that happened to him. At Paint Rock, a town, the train was fired upon and 6 or 8 men wounded. As soon as it could be done, I had the train stopped and, taking a file of soldiers, returned to the village. The telegraph line had been cut. The wire was lying in the street. I told the citizens this bushwhacking must cease. The federal troops had tolerated it too long. Every time a telegraph wire was cut, we would burn a house. Every time a train was fired upon, we would hang a man. And we would do this until every house was burned and every man hanged between Decatur and Bridgeport. If they wanted to fight, they should enter the army, meet us as honorable men, not assassin-like, fire us from the woods and run. So this is what happens when, the Hearts and Minds counterinsurgency fails, which it almost invariably does. And Beatty then learns, what some might call the iron logic of war, and describes the stupid policy of his superior, Don Carlos Buell. Buell is likely to go to an extreme. He is inaugurating the dancing master policy. By your leave, my dear sir, we will have a fight. That is, if you are sufficiently fortified. No hurry, take your own time. And to the bushwhacker, I'm sorry you gentlemen fire at our trains from behind stumps, logs, and ditches. Had you not better cease this kind of warfare? Now do, my good fellows, stop, I beg of you. To the citizen rebel, you are a chivalrous people. You have been aggravated by the abolitionists into subscribing cotton to the Southern Confederacy. You had, of course, a right to dispose of your own property to suit yourselves, but we prefer that you would in future make no more subscriptions of that kind. And in the meantime, we propose to protect your property and guard your Negroes. I mean, he's doing this sarcastically as a way of saying, this is driving me crazy. This policy does not make any sense. But so tight were the 2 sections of the American oligarchy that it was not until the 3rd year of the war that Sherman, who was originally very pro-Southern, finally said, okay, there's only one thing that's going to work. We burn their heartland. And that's how that developed. It wasn't so much, there were no massacres of white Southerners. The record with slaves is not so clear. But there was almost a stylized sexual humiliation of the South in Sherman's march. And it was the only thing that finally got the attention of this sort of rogue section of the American oligarchy. But the most amazing thing about it is that it took them so long to initiate it, because the decades-long habit of being afraid of the Southern elite and of deferring to them, not just even when they were crazy and ferocious, but deferring to them more the more crazy and ferocious they got, was really, really hard to break, even in the middle of a war.
And also, and this goes back to what we talked about in Kansas, their property. I mean, they didn't, as you said, they didn't, despite all the hysterics from the South, they didn't go and massacre people, but they did massacre, as it were, their property, which is more dear to people, to the, to the elites, like more dear certainly than their soldiers and so on, is their property. And
it was more, you're actually completely right. It was more dear than their lives. There are many, many accounts in the diaries saying Southerners will send their only sons to get killed, but they will not loan you their Negroes for a day. And that's by Confederate officers saying this. It drives them crazy.
Yeah. And so they went after their property, and it was sort of like, and that killed them. Like, oh, you got me where it hurt, my plantation. My son, he wrote some great letters. God bless him. But my property,
You can just put in a violin solo for him. But property is another matter.
Yeah. And it did. It worked. I mean, that really broke their spirit, amazingly enough.
Yep. So. And Gurowski was telling him to do it in 1860. It's like, Cassandra Gurowski. That should have been his real name.
So that's the story of Kansas, at least in the 1850s. And Kansas, after that, became the most Republican state of Union states for quite a long time, I think, from what McPherson said, right? I mean, Kansas has been through a lot of incarnations. Yeah, there's that famous Tom Franks, friend of the show, book, What's the Matter with Kansas? And he was writing about, because it went through its socialist phase in the populist era, right? And then now it's back to being Republican, but they're very reactionary sort of Republican. But back then it was a free soil Republican after that experience, we're seeing.
So now, I mean, we're staggering these Civil War episodes. We're not going to do them continuously, but the next one, I think we have to get to the war that most people think of, the one in the East. And so next time we'll talk about the beginning and Bull Run.
Right, and we can go back and forth to sort of somewhat more abstract-y issues, I guess, or cultural issues, and then go back to the war, and we'll sort of go back and forth, I think, right? I mean, between battles and kind of context and stuff, seems to me we're kind of gauging, among other things, the level of prior knowledge we assume, because that's, as we talked about before, not everybody who watches the show is American, not everybody is already interested in this war, so trying to figure out if we're pitching this too low, too high, where should we go? Can I ask one thing too? I don't know how much you heard about this, but I got this a bit from McPherson's book, Battle Cry of Freedom. You had earlier recommended it as the best single volume book, and it is a great single volume book, I think, on the Civil War.
Yeah.
And he seems to say, it's kind of an amazing thing, that the whole crisis over Kansas and Nebraska comes about because Stephen Douglas, of the famous Douglas-Lincoln debates, the Democratic senator. So a Northern Democrat was basically for doing everything to appease the South to keep it as a Union.
Right.
And he was also very rich, unlike Lincoln. And he made a lot of his money in Chicago real estate. And what was Chicago? Chicago was basically the central hub for industrializing and railroadized United States, which by, I think, 1850 or sometime in the 50s, became by far the most railroadized country on the planet. And so he made a bunch of money from the rail lines that went from the east, or to the east, to Chicago, to parts of the west. And he wanted to build a new line that went from Chicago, which is, up in the north, down to Mobile, Alabama, which is a big port city, and of course a lot of money because of the cotton plantations. But in order to do that, the railway would have to pass through the territories of the Nebraska territories. And so they had to organize them to states to get the federal funding, because the way you made all your money was the federal government. Basically, you get a bunch of money from the federal government, and you get the federal government to say, this is where we're putting the rail line. And in advance, like where the spurs are going to be and where you want to put your little town and your paper and everything else to make you rich. So in order to make a bunch of money off that, Douglas and his backers decided, well, we got to basically organize Nebraska into states and bring it into the Union to get the federal government. And that's where this whole shit show starts. And then the South says, whoa, wait a minute. You can't bring in more free states. And Douglas is like, okay, tell me what you want. Slave states? Sure. Here's a slave state. And then the other Northerners like, whoa, wait a minute. You can't have a slave state. So a lot of the Civil War, I mean, it was going to happen anyway, for sure. But that exact timeline kind of got going because Douglas wanted to make another killing off another real estate railroad scam, basically.
Yeah, I don't know as much about that, but that makes perfect sense. I mean, it's a very William Hoagland way of viewing the history. Yeah. And yeah, certainly this was an oligarchy. It was an oligarchy where there was a large, comfortable middle class compared to pretty much any other country in the world. But yeah, it was still run by a very few people who were used to getting insider deals. And it sounds right, because I know that once the war was finally at hand, a lot of Illinois, even though it wasn't particularly anti-slavery, and Southern Illinois was kind of pro-slavery, a lot of Illinois, which was dominated by Chicago, was just not going to stand for the Mississippi being in foreign hands. The Confederacy would have been foreign hands. So,
that's a good point. Yeah.
Yeah, they could not handle that. And that was one of the reasons the Vicksburg and New Orleans campaigns were so important.
Right. That's a really good point, because sometimes people say, well, why not just let the South go? And we'll probably get to this in some future episode as well, but just let them go. They've been a problem. They're the right-wing Republicans now. It's like, they wouldn't have gone anywhere. They would have been right on our asses. And it would have.
And Britain was an old hand at that. Oh, you're in two factions now. Well.
Exactly.
Because as Gorowski said, there was a deep feeling of humiliation and scores to settle by the British elite. The British public was actually pretty noble. But the British elite very much wanted to punish them for the revolution and other offenses. And they would have used this. They would have wound the South, those idiot Confederate hicks, around their little fingers in about 5 seconds. Yeah.
Are you not a gentleman? Do you have no honor? You're gonna let them? Yeah, it would have been so easy. My God. Okay. Anyways, lots of stuff to talk about in future episodes, and this was a great one. Thanks, John, for walking us through this.
It's wonderful to get a chance to do this after, I guess, half a century of looking at battle pictures.
Yeah, that's great. Great stuff. All right. Thanks again, John. Thanks, Brendan. Bye, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.